And then he would go typically and live on the continent. And French Riviera and other places, sometimes Germany, there were favorite locales for these guys to go. And they weren't required to preach so many times a week or to be in their own parish at all, as long as someone was in the pulpit speaking in their place. Jeremy Black, in that book I mentioned, reproduces a letter from one. As long as they hired somebody to read anything, it didn't even have to have spiritual content, but some kind of moralistic something or some kind of beautiful literature, they had fulfilled their duty. But one priest who did stay on the job preached a sermon in which a woman on the front row, a young lady on the front row, he was expressing the most pernicious, in language we would expect to hear at the bar or in the gutter, in his sermon, what he wanted to do with her and his lust for her. There was a dearth of Bible preaching in England during this time because the 1600s had been full of persecution of the Protestants, and many of them were burned at the stake or had fled to Holland and other friendly countries. So the spiritual harvest that was now being reaped in England was such that here and there were bright lights, men of gospel integrity and a love for Jesus. But typically, the church that the people were going to meet on the street and in their local congregation was a tepid, uninterested in their spiritual condition kind of social organization. And that does bring us to society itself. The social society there was, according to one source in London, an estimated 100,000 part or full-time prostitutes. Nearly 5,000 a year died from disease, malnutrition, and violence. And that, again, is in London alone. Famine was not an infrequent visitor throughout the land, most especially in the Irish regions of the kingdom. And class and caste were enforced with an unforgiving severity. Very typical of what Charles Dickens portrays in A Christmas Carol. Johann von Archenholz calculates the number of prostitutes in one district of London to be in the neighborhood of 13,000 and said, quote, "Without these girls, many thousand houses in the West End of London would stand empty." And a plague of cheap so-called quick gin swept the poorer districts. In weeks, it would blind, madden, and kill those who lingered over it. It was the crack cocaine of its day. It was highly, highly addictive. And Hogarth's contemporaneous painting, which we'll see, or wood carving, excuse me, which we'll see here at the end, I'll put it up on the screen so that you can see it, shows the effect of the intoxication. There's a woman with a stupefied, not quite peaceful look on her face. It's the stupefaction of someone who has just numbed themselves, and her baby is falling away. Her suckling baby is falling away from her breast to its injury or death. And behind it is a whole neighborhood full of misery and the awful consequences. Finally, the Parliament stepped in 1751, and they were forced to pass the Gin Act, which regulated the production of gin, because so many of the chemicals that were going into it that had this instantaneous effect that made it like the crack cocaine of its day, made it far different than the kind of gin that's even sold today, poisonous as that may be. They regulated the production so that those things would not be used, and legislated penalties against those who violated that. And at that time, adults and even children could be legally hanged for, like I say, slightly more than 200 different offenses: picking a pocket, stealing a rabbit from a gentleman's property. And into this fetid society, into this kind of a world, on June 7th, 1703, a lad, the 15th of 19 children his mother would eventually bear, a boy whom his mother would forever refer to as "my little Jackie," was born. What about John Wesley? Well, he was small even by 18th century standards. And I'm not going to tell you how tall he was, because when I say small, invariably I get someone come up to me, well, I'm only an inch or two taller than that. And so I'm not going to tell you how tall he was, but if you go to Asbury Seminary, they have a life-size replica of him out there preaching like this. He has a Bible in one hand and his hand lifted aloft, and you stand next to it and you see how you measure up, all right? He traveled, what he lacked in physical presence, he made up for in rugged perseverance, and he traveled more than 250,000 miles, preached more than 40,000 sermons. What about his emotional temperament? Well, whether in his preaching or in his personal conversation, after his heartwarming encounter with God, Mr. Wesley was reported to have been calm and of an even temperament. There's one story about his horse getting away from him, and the carriage in which he was sitting. Everyone else is freaking out, screaming, and the like. And when it's finally brought under control, he steps out fresh as a daisy and calm as can be. I don't have that grace yet. I just want to tell you, I'd have been one of the ones screaming like a sissy in the middle of the carriage. But he figured that until God was through with him, he was as safe as he could be wherever he was, if he was doing his best to follow and pursue God. This was not how he always was, however. His famous episode on board the ship crossing the Atlantic when he'd come to America to be priest to General Oglethorpe in the then colony of Georgia is a famous illustration of that. The storm was on, the Moravians, even the children were singing, giving praise to God, and he was out of his mind with terror. Even the sailors were terror-struck. And when he talked to Peter Böhler and the others, the other Moravians anyhow on board, and asked them what it was that gave them such peace, they told him about this experience that they had had of grace, whereby they knew that they were children of God, and he became hungry for that. Perhaps it was conviction of God's protection. That conviction found its root in his deliverance as a child from the burning rectory at Epworth moments before it collapsed. Now you would think, okay, a great man of God had to come from a peaceful family, a godly family, a family in which Christ was always honored and good order was observed. And you would be wrong. His daddy spent time in debtor's prison because he wasn't real good with his money. He wasn't real careful with his debt, and because of other difficulties that he had no control over as well. But his home life was still the secret fountain of so much good that flowed out of his life. And we attribute most of it to his mother, Susanna, the beneficial influence of his mother. She was a woman of unusual character for her day. She scrupulously watched over the education of each of her children. She was a woman of strong opinions. There came a time when she thought a man sitting on the throne was illegitimately doing so, and she would not say amen to the prayer that her husband and priest prayed at the end of the morning devotions. And so he said, if you won't say amen to the prayer of the king, you won't share my bed. Which was fine with her. You can imagine having that many children. It probably was like a vacation. And so they were separated for some time. Did not ice, I guess. It became an ice house. And did not have much conversation of any pleasant content. But they were eventually reconciled. And when they were reconciled, 9 months later, a child named John, what's his middle name? Do you know? John Benjamin Wesley was born. He was named Benjamin after a brother that had been born previously but had died shortly after childbirth, was born. So he was the product of make-up love. And his mother opened her home for the spiritual welfare of others in her community. Had prayer and studied the scriptures together. She did what by our definition today can only be called teaching or preaching to those of her community so that they would hear a soul-changing gospel of Jesus Christ. And from her little kitchen, and then later on the parlor, came a great move among the local folk there. Now, Wesley's father, as I said, was shut up in debtor's prison for some time, all of this while he was serving as the rector of Epworth Parish. I don't really have time to talk to you about old Jeffrey, but if you ever get a chance, you want to look up old Jeffrey. As a boy, I loved reading some of the notations that Wesley made about him. He's something unexplained. We'll just say that. It was a presence in the house that was unexplained. As I don't believe in ghosts, I'll not say it was a ghost. How about his training? Well, as we noted above, his homeschooling was absolutely sterling. It was above average in every respect. But then he entered the Charterhouse School at age 10, matriculated at Christ Church, Oxford at age 17 in 1720. And 4 years later, he received his Bachelor of Arts and was ordained a deacon in the Anglican Church. 1 year after that, he was ordained a priest. His work from the earliest, he was taught to reverence God and fulfill the Christian duties of prayer, church attendance, and charity. And these remained with him his whole life. The influence again shaped in his childhood to love and serve and obey God. Sometime after entering Oxford University, John joined in 1729 a group of students known as the Holy Club, later to be called derisively the Methodists. This group, although begun by John's younger brother, Charles, soon turns to John for leadership, and their goal was to recover the original simplicity and usefulness that the first Christians had by methodically observing times of prayer and Bible study and by doing good among the poor and the needy. 1735, as I say, he was commissioned by General Oglethorpe to be priest of the new colony of Georgia, and stayed there for a period of time, about 3 years, and he comes back to England in February 1st, 1738, after a hugely unsuccessful ministry here in the United States. If you've never read that part of his life, you need to see what John Wesley would be like without God. It will mirror in many respects every effort you and I have put ourselves to that we did without undertaking his help and his guidance. Over the course of his life, he and the Methodists will found Sunday schools to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to children who on other days were virtual slaves. They founded orphanages to care for tens of thousands of street children left wandering the streets of England due to their parents' death or addiction or poverty and sickness. They founded hospitals to care for those who could not otherwise afford the least medical attention. They founded religious societies to attend to the spiritual and physical needs of their adherents. Prison ministries to humanize this most beastly part of British society by tending to the bodily needs of prisoners and bringing the good news of God's love to them. Workhouses, and they weren't workhouses as dreary as they've been made out to be. They were hope in this island of shrinking economic opportunity. They were a way to be trained for other jobs that might be available in your area, and often they provided a way up from the poverty that people were living in. And they founded chapels, and the chapels of their day were the most heartfelt, passionate, warmly